In the darkness of the night, the shadows of the old oak trees danced in front of the imposing Mason mansion, a testament to the opulence of a bygone era. The moon, shy, attempted to hide behind the clouds as if refusing to witness the events of that night. Inside the house, a family gathering was taking place, but it was no ordinary meeting. It was a ritual, an almost sacred ceremony in which the dark legacy of the Masons would once again be reaffirmed. Samuel Mason, the family patriarch, a man of rigid posture and eyes as sharp as blades, sat at the head of the massive oak table, a piece that had witnessed generations of similar gatherings. He observed his children and grandchildren with a gaze that seemed to pierce the soul of each one. Beside him, a glass of whiskey remained untouched for that night. Samuel did not need alcohol to warm his blood. The anger and hatred he had harbored for decades already served that purpose. Ethan Mason, Samuel's favorite grandson, sat to his grandfather's right, feeling the crushing weight of family expectations on his shoulders. He was 28 years old, a strong young man with a face that reflected the same severity as his grandfather's. But his eyes, unlike Samuel's, carried something deeper, a spark of doubt. As Samuel spoke of the pride and superiority of the Masons, Ethan could not ignore the feeling of discomfort that crept into his chest. It was as if each word spoken was a nail being driven into a coffin, and that coffin was Ethan's future. The Mason tradition is not something that can be questioned, Samuel said, his voice roaring like a lion's, authoritative and unwavering. For generations, our family has kept this town under control, protecting it from those who don't deserve the same respect. You, my children, my grandchildren, are the guardians of this legacy. You must not stray from the path we've carved with so much blood and sweat. Samuel's words were heavy, laden with a subtle violence that had been passed down from generation to generation. He spoke with a conviction that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. His children nodded silently, revering their father's authority, but Ethan, though he remained quiet, felt a rebellion growing within him. With every word, he realized that the legacy Samuel so exalted was, in reality, an invisible chain binding them to a past stained with prejudice and intolerance. The world out there is changing, but we, the Masons, must not bow to this tide of weakness. Our strength lies in the purity of our blood, in our ability to command respect, and in our determination to keep what is ours, Samuel continued, pounding his clenched fist on the table. Ethan, you are the future of this family. The responsibility is yours now. You understand that, don't you? Ethan, feeling all eyes on him, forced a nod. But inside, his heart was in turmoil. He understood, yes, what was being asked of him, but the questions that had long haunted his mind now screamed for answers. How could he continue to bear this cursed inheritance? A legacy built on hatred, on the exclusion of other human beings, on a blind belief in their own superiority? The meeting ended with a toast, but the bitter taste of that expensive whiskey burned Ethan's throat in a different way that night. He knew that the coming weeks would be decisive. What would he do with the Mason legacy? Doubt consumed him, and as the family dispersed, Ethan lingered, staring at the portrait of his great-grandfather hanging on the wall, a man whose severe expression reflected the weight of the inheritance now resting on his shoulders. Alone in the room, Ethan felt a silent tear roll down his face. He knew that somehow he would need to find a path for himself, far from the shadow of that ancestral hatred that threatened to devour his soul. The scorching August heat hung in the air like a curse, causing even the birds to hide in the shadows. The small town of Pinewood, usually quiet, seemed to vibrate with a latent energy, as if something was about to happen. And it was, that day, an unfamiliar figure crossed the town's invisible boundaries, bringing with her a breeze of change that few expected, but many feared. Claire Johnson was no ordinary person. She was a force of nature wrapped in a calm smile, a 32-year-old woman, tall and slender, with dark skin that gleamed under the sun and braids that fell gently over her shoulders. Her eyes, a deep brown, carried a serenity that few could maintain in the face of adversity. but there was also an unyielding determination in them, a flame that never went out, no matter how strong the wind against it. Claire's car, a modest blue sedan, moved slowly down Pinewood's main road, attracting curious and, in some cases, suspicious glances. She knew she wouldn't be welcomed by everyone there. Her very presence was a challenge to the status quo, a rupture in the bubble of homogeneity the town so cherished. But Claire wasn't one to run away. She was there for a greater purpose, and nothing, no one, would deter her from her mission. As she drove, the smooth sound of Nina Simone played on the radio, calming her nerves. She passed by the town's market, where a group of middle-aged men watched her with narrowed eyes and subtle gestures of disapproval. Claire felt the hostility in the air, but decided to ignore it. There was more at stake than the judgmental looks of those clinging to a past that refused to die. Her destination was Pinewood High School, an old structure with red bricks and tall windows that seemed to hold ancient secrets. The school was practically deserted at that moment, except for one figure waiting at the entrance, Mrs. Evelyn Harper, the principal, a woman with graying hair tied in a tight bun and an expression that combined cordiality with latent caution. "You must be Claire Johnson," Mrs. Harper said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, that's me. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Harper," Claire replied, shaking the principal's hand firmly, her voice exuding the confidence of someone who knew exactly why she was there. "I hope you had a pleasant journey," Mrs. Harper continued, casting a quick glance around, as if checking if anyone was paying attention. "Pinewood is a small town, but we're always open to new ideas, within certain limits, of course." Claire smiled back, but inside, she felt the irony in the principal's words. She knew that certain limits was a polite way of saying there were unspoken rules about who was welcome and who was not. But Claire wasn't there to ask for permission. She was there to teach, to inspire, and perhaps, just maybe, to plant the seed of change in that soil hardened by time and prejudice. As Mrs. Harper led her through the school corridors, introducing her to some of the empty classrooms, Claire could feel the history embedded in those walls. There was something oppressive there, a sense that those bricks had witnessed more than they were willing to reveal. But Claire also felt that there was potential, an opportunity to transform that school, to offer the students something they might never have known, the true freedom of thought. The afternoon dragged on, and when Claire finally left the school, she found herself alone in the courtyard, looking at the horizon where the sun began to hide behind the hills. She felt a slight breeze touch her face, like a sign that something was about to happen. Pinewood was a place that didn't want her, but Claire knew it was exactly where she needed to be. And as she walked back to her car, a thought as clear as crystal emerged in her mind. She wasn't there to fit in, but to spark a change Pinewood would never forget. The afternoon in Pinewood was suffused with the sweet scent of summer, but for Ethan Mason, the air felt heavy, suffocating. He stood on the mansion's porch, gazing at the vastness of the fields that stretched as far as his eyes could see. That land had belonged to the Masons for generations, along with the weight of expectations that now rested on his shoulders. But that afternoon, something was different. There was a restlessness within Ethan, a sense that the ground beneath his feet, once solid and dependable, was beginning to give way, revealing an abyss he feared to face. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him from his thoughts. It was his father, Robert Mason, a man of sturdy build, with a face etched by time and a life of hard work. Robert bore the gravity of someone who had always known his place in the world. He approached Ethan, his expression as serious as ever. "Ethan, there's something we need to discuss," Robert began, his voice as firm as a rock. "I've been hearing things about you and that new teacher, Claire Johnson." Ethan's heart leapt in his chest. He knew his father was a man of few words, but each one was as heavy as lead. Ethan tried to maintain his composure, but the mention of Claire sent his mind into a whirlwind. "I don't know what you're talking about, Dad," Ethan replied, trying to mask the tension in his voice. "Don't be naive, son," Robert retorted, with an undertone of latent disapproval. "People talk in this town, and they notice when something is out of place. You've been seen talking to her. Do you know what that means? Do you know what that does to our family's name?" Ethan felt the weight of his father's words like a fist tightening around his heart. The truth was, he had met Claire in town a few days before, a chance encounter that, to his surprise, had left a deep impression on his soul. There was something about her, a strength and kindness he had never found in anyone before. But at that moment, under his father's penetrating gaze, Ethan felt the terror of being pulled between two worlds, his family's and a truth that was beginning to reveal itself. "She's just a teacher, Dad. Nothing more," Ethan said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were insufficient. "A teacher who doesn't belong here," Robert replied, in a tone that left no room for discussion. "This town has its rules, Ethan, and we, the Masons, are the guardians of those rules. We can't allow an outsider, especially someone like her, to come here and tell us how we should live." Ethan looked at his father. The dark eyes of the man he had always admired now seemed so strange, so distant. The admiration he had always felt was now being eroded by the growing sense of revolt and confusion. How could he continue to live under this shadow? How could he deny what his heart was beginning to say? What he felt for Claire, though still an embryonic feeling, was something he couldn't simply ignore. "I understand, Dad," Ethan said, more out of instinct than conviction. But inside, he felt something breaking, like the first crack in a dam that, sooner or later, would give way under the pressure. Robert stared at him for a moment, as if searching for signs of weakness. Satisfied with the superficial response, he nodded and turned to leave. But before he left, he issued one last warning. "Don't forget, Ethan, you carry the Mason name. Don't stain it." As Robert walked away, Ethan stood on the porch, staring at the horizon with a growing emptiness in his chest. His father's words echoed in his mind, but instead of sticking, they began to unravel, like smoke in the wind. For the first time, Ethan felt that the Mason name, which he had always carried with such pride, was becoming a curse. And so, deep in his heart, the first crack appeared, signaling the beginning of a battle he could not avoid. Claire Johnson was not just a teacher. She was the catalyst that was beginning to expose the cracks in a foundation that had always seemed unshakable. And Ethan knew that eventually he would have to choose which side he would stand on when the edifice of his life began to crumble. The night in Pinewood was thick and stifling, as if the very atmosphere was preparing to reveal a long-buried secret. Claire Johnson, ever curious and driven by an inner force she barely understood, found herself once again in the small-town library, a place that had become a refuge for her restless thoughts since her arrival. The dusty books, the dark wooden shelves, and the smell of aged pages were a welcome contrast to the tension pulsating through Pinewood streets. That night, however, something was different. There was a file, old and nearly forgotten, that Claire discovered while sifting through the local history section. It was a leather folder with the name Mason engraved in gold letters, nearly faded by time. Claire's heart raced. She knew the Masons were a powerful family in the town, but something about that file seemed to beg for discovery, as if fate had led her to it. Without hesitation, Claire carried the folder to a table in a dark corner of the library. Upon opening it, she was greeted by a series of yellow documents dated decades ago, and a black and white photograph showing a group of men, all with stern faces, lined up in front of a house Claire instantly recognized as the Mason Mansion. At the center of the photo was a man with an intense gaze and a thick mustache, Ethan's great-grandfather, Henry Mason. But there was something disturbing about the image, something that made Claire's blood run cold. Beside Henry, standing with a submissive expression, was an African-American man, clearly dressed in simple clothes, with his hands crossed in front of him. He wasn't part of the group. He was there as a symbol, a sinister reminder of what had been. Claire continued to examine the documents. Among them, she found old contracts signed by Henry Mason detailing the purchase of lands and properties in the region. But there was more. Private correspondence, letters exchanged between the Masons and other members of the local elite, revealed a dark agreement. The Masons not only owned much of Pinewood's land, but had actively participated in practices of intimidation, coercion, and in more extreme cases, the persecution of African-American families who dared to challenge their dominance. One letter, in particular, caught Claire's attention. It was dated 1932 and mentioned a corrective action carried out to ensure that an African-American family was removed from a property. The family's name was Johnson. Claire felt a knot form in her stomach. Could there be a connection between her own lineage and the Masons' dirty secrets? The weight of the discovery made Claire sink into the chair. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in an unsettling way. The Masons' power didn't just come from their wealth, but from a system of oppression carefully maintained for generations. That file was more than a relic of the past. It was living evidence of a legacy built on the backs of the vulnerable, the forgotten. In the silence of the library, Claire realized she was holding something dangerous, something that could shake the foundations of the Mason family and perhaps all of Pinewood. But she also knew she couldn't simply ignore what she had found. This was the kind of truth that, once revealed, could not be buried again. As she closed the folder and hid it in her bag, Claire felt the urgency to share what she had discovered with someone she could trust. Ethan immediately came to mind, but she knew that doing so would put both of them in danger. Still, the moral dilemma weighed heavily on her shoulders. Should she confront Ethan with the secret of his family, risking their already strained relationship? Or should she keep the discovery to herself until she knew more? As Claire left the library, the moon was high in the sky, like a silent witness to the secret she now carried. The wind seemed to murmur something incomprehensible, as if Pinewood itself was aware that its past was about to be unearthed. And Claire, with the Mason folder clutched tightly against her chest, felt that she was on the brink of something much larger than anyone could predict. The sky over Pinewood was tinged with an unsettling gray, as if foreshadowing the storm that was about to descend upon the town. In the streets, the air seemed electrified, charged with a tension that everyone could feel, but no one dared to name. Inside the high school, however, that tension was about to erupt. Claire Johnson, in her classroom, tried to maintain her composure while her students, distracted and restless, cast furtive glances out the window, where dark clouds gathered like omens of something terrible. But the real storm was brewing within the school itself. Whispered words in the hallways, looks of disdain, and muffled laughter indicated that something was in the works, something that Claire knew she would have to confront head-on. The first indication that something was wrong came when a group of students, led by Jake Harris, the son of one of the town's most influential businessmen, entered the classroom with an air of superiority that made Claire's blood boil. Jake, at 17, was the epitome of privilege, an arrogant young man who believed he was above consequences. He positioned himself in the center of the room, staring at Claire with a smile that was anything but friendly. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice dripping with disdain, "we've heard that you're bringing new ideas to our school, things that don't belong in places like Pinewood." Claire lifted her eyes from the book she was reading to the class, feeling a wave of adrenaline pulse through her veins. She knew Jake wasn't alone in this provocation. He represented the sentiments of many in the town, a sentiment that had been carefully cultivated over decades. "I'm here to teach you all to think for yourselves, Jake," Claire responded, keeping her voice firm but calm. "That means sometimes we'll discuss ideas that may not be comfortable, but that are necessary." Jake let out a dry laugh, and other students joined in, a chorus of mockery that made the classroom feel more like a gladiator's arena. "Oh, sure, but you know, some things just don't change. No matter what you say or do, Pinewood will always be Pinewood, and certain people will always know their place." Those words, laced with venom and thinly veiled racism, hit Claire like a blow. But before she could respond, another sound echoed through the corridors, the sound of breaking glass. Everyone in the room turned to the window, where a stone had been thrown, shattering the glass and scattering shards across the floor. On the stone, there was a message written in red ink, aggressive and malicious. "Go away, Claire." The classroom fell into a dead silence as Claire looked at the stone, feeling the palpable threat in the air. She knew this wasn't just an act of juvenile vandalism. It was a warning, an attempt at intimidation. And the most disturbing part was that this intimidation came from a culture deeply rooted in the town, a culture that the Masons, with their legacy of hate, had helped to build. But before she could react, The classroom door swung open and Robert Mason, Ethan's father, entered with heavy steps. The silence that had already fallen over the room became almost suffocating. Robert, with fierce eyes and a face wrinkled by anger, looked directly at Claire, completely ignoring the students around him. "Miss Johnson," he began, not even trying to hide his disdain, "I think it's time you reconsidered your position here. We don't want trouble in our town, and it seems your presence is causing just that." Claire felt the weight of his words, but instead of backing down, she straightened her shoulders and met Robert's gaze with a courage that came from something deeper. "My position here, Mr. Mason, is to teach these young people to think for themselves, to question, to grow. If that's a problem, then perhaps the issue isn't with me, but with those who are resisting change." Robert took a step forward, anger seething in every line of his face. "We don't need people like you stirring things up. You think you can change all of this? People like you come and go, but Pinewood remains." Claire, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on her, knew she was at a crossroads, but she didn't back down. "I know it's hard to change what's ingrained, Mr. Mason, but change begins with one step, and I'm here to take that step, whether you like it or not." The tension in the air was about to break, and everyone felt it. Jake, the other students, and even Robert. But in that moment, Claire knew that the conflict on the horizon wasn't just between her and the Masons, but between a dark past and a future she refused to give up on. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, as heavy as the weight on Ethan Mason's chest. He walked slowly along the dirt road leading to the forest, the sound of dry leaves crunching under his feet blending with the distant murmur of the wind. Nature, which had always been a refuge for his thoughts, now seemed to reflect the internal storm consuming him. The choice he needed to make was becoming increasingly clear, but the price of that decision was something he wasn't yet prepared to pay. Ethan knew that one way or another, everything would change after that night. The recent confrontations with his father and the growing tension in the town had brought him to a breaking point. He could no longer ignore what was happening around him. The discrimination, the veiled hatred, and now, the direct attack on Claire. And more than that, he couldn't ignore what was happening inside himself. That internal conflict that had once been just a mild unease was now a burning flame, growing more intense by the day. Robert Mason's words, his father's, echoed in his mind like a hammer striking incessantly. "We, the Masons, are the guardians of this town. We won't let anyone destroy what we've built." To Robert, the idea of change was a direct threat to the legacy he had inherited and intended to pass on. But to Ethan, that legacy now felt more like a prison than a privilege. Finally, he stopped in a small clearing within the forest, a place he had frequented since childhood. The spot was surrounded by ancient, strong trees, silent witnesses to his many internal struggles. But today, Ethan was not alone. In the distance, he saw Claire waiting for him, her face a mixture of concern and determination. She knew this conversation would be decisive, and as she waited for Ethan, she felt a growing anxiety within her. "You came," she said as Ethan approached, her voice soft as a breeze, but carrying a weight they both felt. "I had no choice," Ethan replied, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if the words he wanted to say were buried there. "I needed to talk to you. I needed to understand what's happening to me." Claire stepped forward, her eyes searching Ethan's, trying to find some spark of hope in that confusion. "And what did you discover?" Ethan finally looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "I discovered that everything I was taught, everything my family represents is wrong. I can't be a part of it anymore, Claire. I can't keep carrying this hate, this blindness. But I also don't know how to leave it all behind." Ethan's confession hung in the air like a prayer, a plea for redemption. Claire felt a wave of compassion for him, but she knew this was a path he would have to walk alone. "Ethan, no one can make that decision for you. But the fact that you're here, that you're questioning, already means a lot. It means you're not like them, but it also means that if you choose the other path, it won't be easy." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of Claire's words. He knew that if he made this decision, he would lose everything he knew, his family, his status, his life as he understood it. But what he also knew, with a clarity he had never experienced before, was that continuing on the path laid out by his family would mean losing himself. "I'm scared," Ethan admitted, his voice breaking under the pressure. "Scared of losing myself, of losing everything. Sometimes, to find ourselves, we need to lose ourselves first," Claire replied, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "And you won't be alone. I'm here. There are others like us who want something different, something better." Ethan looked at Claire, seeing in her not just a friend, but the embodiment of the choice he knew he had to make. In that moment, he realized that true courage wasn't in blindly following what was expected, but in challenging, in breaking the vicious cycle that held him captive. With a deep sigh, Ethan made his decision. "I can't be a Mason anymore, at least not the way they want. I'm going to fight, Claire. I'm going to fight for what's right, even if it means fighting against my own family." Claire smiled, a sad smile, but full of hope. "Then, Ethan, maybe for the first time in your life, you're truly free." As night fell over Pinewood, Ethan and Claire knew that his choice was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, a battle that would test not only the strength of their convictions, but also the power of the legacy of hate they were determined to break. The distant sound of thunder echoed through the hills of Pinewood, a dark prelude to the storm approaching. But the real storm wasn't the one forming in the skies. It was the one boiling in the streets of the small town, fueled by years of resentment, prejudice, and hatred. Whispers had turned into shouts, and the air was charged with an electricity that made everyone's skin crawl. What was about to happen wasn't just a confrontation. It was the collapse of a carefully maintained facade that had stood for generations. Ethan Mason stood on the porch of his family's mansion, looking down at the town where small groups were beginning to gather. He knew that tonight would be decisive. Since making the decision to distance himself from his family's legacy, he had felt the growing weight of inevitability. Things couldn't continue as they were, and he, more than anyone, knew that the resistance to this change would be fierce. In the town's central square, the people of Pinewood were gathering, drawn by a shared feeling, a primal impulse that united them in their fear of the unknown and the need to preserve what they believed was rightfully theirs. Men and women, faces hardened by life and prejudices passed down through generations, carried signs and torches, their eyes shining with barely contained fury. At the front, leading the group like a general guiding his troops, was Robert Mason, his father, with the steely gaze Ethan knew so well. Robert raised one of the torches, his face illuminated by the dancing flame. "Pinewood is ours," he shouted, his powerful voice reverberating off the surrounding buildings. "We will not allow outsiders, those who do not understand our history, to destroy what our ancestors built with blood and sweat." The approving roars were deafening, a collective roar that seemed to shake the very ground. But there was something more that night, something beyond anger. There was fear. Fear of what Claire represented. Fear of what Ethan might do by defying his own lineage. And that fear manifested in fury, in the need to crush any threat before it could take root. Across town, Claire Johnson watched the scene with a heavy heart. She was at the small church on top of a hill, a place that had always been a refuge, but now seemed vulnerable in the face of the approaching storm. Around her, a few community members who sympathized with her cause had gathered, their faces pale with apprehension. They knew that opposing the Masons and the mob meant exposing themselves to danger, but they also knew that if they didn't, the town would never change. "Is Ethan with them?" a woman beside Claire asked, her voice trembling. Claire hesitated for a moment before responding. "No, he's not one of them anymore, but he needs to do this for himself." She knew Ethan was at a crossroads, one that would require a choice that would define not just his future, but the future of all Pinewood. And as she thought about it, a terrible idea crossed her mind. What if he couldn't make the right choice? In the town center, the situation was spiraling out of control. Words had turned into shoves into punches. The flames of the torches illuminated the chaos that was beginning to spread. Ethan knew he had no more time. He ran down from the porch, his heart pounding frantically, and headed toward the square, knowing that every second of delay could mean the difference between life and death. When he arrived, the chaos was complete. Men and women were shouting, and there was blood in the air, a metallic and nauseating smell that made his head spin. But even in the midst of the confusion, Ethan spotted his father, Robert, who was about to throw the torch toward the church where Claire and the others were sheltered. "Father, stop!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the turmoil. But Robert didn't hear, or maybe he chose not to hear. Time seemed to slow as Ethan ran toward his father, his heart breaking at the sight of the man he had respected and feared all his life, now consumed by blind hatred. Ethan tackled Robert at the last second, knocking him to the ground. The torch fell from his hands and rolled across the pavement, slowly extinguishing. The crowd around them stopped, surprised by the interruption, their eyes wide as they watched the confrontation between father and son. Robert looked at Ethan with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "What are you doing, Ethan? You're betraying your own family, your own town." Ethan, panting, stood up, looking at his father with infinite sadness. "I'm trying to save what's left of us, Father. This hatred, it will destroy us. I can't be a part of it anymore. Pinewood deserves more than a legacy of hate." The silence that followed was heavy, as if the very air had been sucked out of the place. Robert, still on the ground, looked at Ethan with eyes that seemed to finally grasp what was happening. But before he could respond, another thunderclap roared, and the real storm finally broke over Pinewood, washing the streets and extinguishing the flames of the torches. Ethan knew the battle was far from over. But in that moment, as the rain fell like tears over the town, he felt for the first time that there was a chance for redemption, a chance to rebuild something new from the ashes. And that chance, no matter how small, was all he needed to keep fighting. The rain fell incessantly over Pinewood, washing away the dust and blood that had stained the streets the night before. The morning silence was almost surreal, as if the town was mourning itself for shattered dreams and broken illusions. But for Ethan Mason, the silence was deafening. He knew that the calm was only temporary, the prelude to an even greater storm, one that couldn't be avoided. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, his eyes fixed on the worn wooden floor. Every thought in his mind was a thread woven into a web of guilt, fear, and uncertainty. He had defied his father, broken away from a legacy of generations, and now faced the consequences of his choice. But the weight of that decision was beginning to reveal itself as unbearable. The bedroom door opened slowly, and his mother, Margaret Mason, entered with hesitant steps. She was a woman of gentle features, but her face was marked by sadness and the exhaustion of a life of conformity. She approached Ethan, sitting beside him, her trembling hands resting on his. "Ethan," she began, her voice low, almost a whisper, "I know you did what you thought was right, but now we're all paying for it." Ethan lifted his eyes to her, feeling a deep pain in his chest. "I couldn't keep living that lie, Mom. I couldn't just pretend everything was okay." Margaret sighed, her eyes filling with tears. "But son, that lie was all we knew. And now look what's happened. Your father, he's not the same anymore. He shut himself off even more. The whole town is divided, and we were losing everything." Ethan felt the weight of his mother's words like a sharp blade cutting into his soul. He knew the path he had chosen would be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated how much it would cost those he loved. The Mason mansion, which had long been a symbol of power and stability, now felt like a crumbling castle, about to collapse under the weight of the past it had tried so hard to maintain. "They've left us," Margaret continued, her voice trembling. "The staff, the neighbors, even the closest friends. We're alone now, Ethan. And I don't know how we'll survive this." Ethan swallowed hard, fighting against the feeling of despair threatening to engulf him. He knew that change would come with a price, but the reality of that price was far more bitter than he had imagined. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mom. I just wanted to do what was right." Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with resigned sadness. "Sometimes, doing what's right doesn't bring peace, Ethan. Sometimes it only brings pain. And you need to be prepared for that. The town isn't just going to accept what you've done. They're going to fight, and they're going to do everything they can to destroy us. His mother's words echoed in Ethan's mind as he stood up from the bed, driven by a force he barely understood. I know, Mom, but the truth is, Pinewood needs to change, and I'm not going to give up no matter what happens. Margaret watched her son for a long moment, as if trying to see the man he had become, not the boy she had raised. If you believe that, Ethan, then I believe it too. But know that this change may cost us everything. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility growing even heavier on his shoulders. He knew there was no turning back, that the path ahead was filled with dangers and sacrifices. But he also knew that even if he lost everything, he couldn't live with himself if he didn't stand by his decision. As the rain continued to fall outside, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity. Change would never be easy, and the price would be high. But if the alternative was living a lie, trapped in a legacy of hatred and fear, then he was willing to pay that price, no matter how painful it might be. When Margaret finally left the room, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts, he looked out the window, watching the water running down the glass like silent tears. The town of Pinewood was on the brink of a new beginning, a beginning he had helped to create. And although the road ahead was uncertain, Ethan knew that, one way or another, change was coming, and he was ready to face it, no matter what came next. The cost of change was high, but for Ethan, the cost of not changing was even higher. The first lights of morning barely illuminated Pinewood, but the town was already in a state of simmering unrest. The air was thick with a grim expectation, as if everyone knew something irrevocable was about to happen. Ethan Mason felt it in his bones as he walked down the deserted road leading to the Mason mansion, the place where it all began, and where it might all end. The house, once grand, now seemed like a ghost of its former self, with its broken windows and creaking doors. The walls that once held whispers of power and conspiracy now echoed with desolation. But Ethan knew it wasn't the house that was in ruins. It was his family, his own identity, and perhaps Pinewood itself. When Ethan crossed the rusted gate, he was greeted by a scene that broke his heart. In the center of the devastated garden, Samuel Mason, his grandfather, sat in an old rocking chair, his eyes lost in a horizon only he could see. Samuel, the man who had always personified the unyielding power of the Masons, now seemed a shadow, broken and defeated by the weight of his own actions. "Grandpa," Ethan began, his voice soft but laden with the pain of all the revelations and decisions of the past days. "I need to talk to you." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He continued to rock slowly in the chair, the rhythmic sound of the wooden boards echoing through the garden. When he finally spoke, his voice was weak, almost a whisper. "You did what you had to do, Ethan. I don't need your apologies." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He knew that by defying his family, he had broken something much larger than the Mason pride. He had broken the bond that had united generations, a bond that, however corrupt and poisoned it might have been, was still a part of who he was. "I'm not here to apologize, Grandpa," Ethan said, stepping forward, trying to find his grandfather's eyes. "I'm here to try to understand. How do we let this happen? How do we let hatred consume us to the point of destroying us?" Samuel finally lifted his gaze, his tired eyes filled with a sadness Ethan had never seen before. "You don't understand, Ethan. It was never about hatred. It was about power. It was about control, about protecting what was ours, or at least what we thought was ours." Ethan shook his head, feeling frustration and pain bubble up inside him. "But it wasn't ours, Grandpa. None of this was really ours. We stole, oppressed, destroyed lives to maintain this illusion of power. And now we're paying the price." Samuel sighed, a tired sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "You're right, but you don't understand what it's like to carry the weight of a family, of an entire town. I did what I thought was necessary, and now I see I was wrong. But it's too late, Ethan. Too late for redemption." Samuel's words hit Ethan like a blow. He knew his grandfather was right. Some things couldn't be undone, couldn't be erased. But even so, He couldn't accept that all was lost. "It's not too late," Ethan insisted, the determination igniting in his chest. "We can change, Grandpa. We can do things differently. We can rebuild, not with hatred, but with understanding, with compassion." Samuel laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter, only deep bitterness. "And you really believe Pinewood will accept that? That the town will forgive? You're mistaken, Ethan. They don't want change. They want blood." Ethan was silent for a moment, letting Samuel's words sink into his mind. He knew that change wouldn't be easy, knew it would be resisted every step of the way. But he also knew that if they didn't try, all that would be left was ruin. "Then let the blood come," Ethan finally said, his voice low but charged with new determination. "If that's what they want, so be it. But I won't give up. I won't let our family be remembered only for hate and destruction. I'll fight, Grandpa, and I'll fight to the end." Samuel looked at his grandson, seeing in him the flame he himself had lost long ago. Maybe there was a chance, after all, a chance that, through Ethan, the Masons might find a redemption he himself had never been able to achieve. As Ethan walked away from the mansion, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts, he felt the weight of his words. The choice between redemption and ruin was before him, and he knew that, one way or another, the battle was just beginning. But he was ready, because deep down, he knew that the real ruin wouldn't come from losing power or status. It would come from losing his own soul if he didn't fight for what he believed was right. And Pinewood, this town marked by so many scars, would have to decide whether it too would seek redemption or choose to sink into the ruin of a past it could no longer sustain. Morning in Pinewood arrived with an unexpected gentleness, as if the world had finally calmed after the storm. The sun, shy but present, broke through the gray clouds, spreading a golden light over the town that still bore the marks of a struggle that seemed to last an eternity. But for Ethan Mason, this light was not just a sign of a new day. It was the promise of a new beginning. Ethan stood in the central square, the heart of Pinewood, where he had so often felt the pressure of his family's legacy. But now, as he looked around, everything seemed different. The flags of intolerance and hatred had been taken down, replaced by something simpler but infinitely more powerful: hope. The town was quiet, but there was no longer the oppressive weight that once hid in the shadows. There was a sense of renewal in the air, something Ethan never thought he would see in Pinewood. In front of him, a group of residents began to gather, familiar and new faces alike, all drawn by the same promise of change. Claire Johnson was among them, her eyes shining with quiet determination. She approached Ethan, and for a moment, they stood in silence, sharing a mutual understanding, a deep respect for what they had achieved together. "We did it," Claire finally said, her voice filled with emotion. "You did it, Ethan." Ethan smiled, a smile that carried both relief and pain. "We did it," he corrected, looking around at the growing crowd. "But there's still so much to do. This is just the beginning." The crowd grew with each passing minute, and among the faces, Ethan saw people who would never have joined together for a common cause before. Old rivals, former opponents, now gathered with a greater purpose. There was something different in their eyes, an understanding that hadn't existed before. Perhaps the battle, the pain, and the losses they had suffered had united them in ways they could never have predicted. The town's mayor, a man who had remained silent for so long, stepped up onto a small improvised platform. His voice trembled slightly as he began to speak, but there was a newfound firmness in his words. Pinewood has been, for too long, a divided town. Divided by prejudices, by fears, by a legacy that should no longer define us. Today, we begin something new. Today, we choose a different path. The crowd murmured in approval, and Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. This was the moment he had fought for, the moment for which almost everything had been sacrificed. But even so, he knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow, painful, but necessary process. After the mayor finished speaking, Ethan approached the platform, hesitating for a moment before stepping up. He wasn't a speaker, but he knew he needed to say something, When he looked at the people who now watched him with expectation, he took a deep breath and let the words flow. Pinewood has always been my home, and like many of you, I grew up hearing stories about what it means to be a Mason, about what it means to be part of this town. But over the past few days, I've realized that being part of Pinewood means much more than maintaining traditions or protecting legacies. It means accepting our faults, learning from our mistakes, and above all, being willing to change. He paused, letting his words resonate in the silent square. We can't erase the past, but we can learn from it. We can build something new, something better together. And that change begins with each of us, with how we choose to treat one another, with how we choose to live our lives. Ethan stepped down from the platform, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him as the crowd applauded, not with the fervent excitement of a rally, but with the recognition of a new commitment. They knew the work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, there was a collective will to move forward. Claire approached again, her hand lightly touching Ethan's arm. "Are you ready for this?" Ethan looked at her, feeling the truth of her words settle within him. "I think I'll never be fully ready, but I'm willing to try." As the crowd began to disperse, Ethan felt a new sense of purpose. The ruin he had feared still loomed on the horizon, but now there was something stronger at his side, the possibility of redemption. And with that possibility, Pinewood was beginning to write a new chapter in its history. A chapter where the legacy of hate and division would finally be replaced by a future of unity and hope. The sun continued to rise in the sky, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt that the brightness of that light was not just a reflection of the day, but a metaphor for what was to come. And as he and Claire walked together through the square, side by side, he knew that, no matter what the future held, they would be ready to face it together. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a like, and this other video appearing on the screen now will probably move you as well. Enjoy, and see you in the next video.